There are moments in television history that don't just make headlines, they rewrite them. Moments where a single broadcast, a single scene, a single joke becomes a spark that ignites a fire nobody can control. The Benny Hill Show had survived for decades on the strength of its unapologetic humor, its manic energy, and the magnetic charisma of the man at its center. For millions of viewers across Britain and eventually across the world, Thursday night meant Benny Hill. The chase sequences, the double entendres, the rubber-faced mugging, and that inescapable theme tune bouncing through living rooms like a hyperactive guest who never quite knew when to leave. But television, like all cultural institutions, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It breathes the same air as the society around it. And in the late 1980s, that air was changing fast. What had once felt like harmless, cheeky entertainment was now being examined under a far harsher light. Critics were sharpening their pens. Audiences were asking harder questions. And inside Thames Television, the executives who had built Benny Hill into a global commodity were quietly wondering whether the golden goose had finally laid its last egg. Then came the scene. The sketch that, more than any other moment in the show's long and complicated history, crystallized every criticism, inflamed every opponent, and handed those who wanted the show gone exactly the ammunition they needed. This is the story of that moment, the man behind it, and the cultural earthquake that brought one of Britain's most beloved and most controversial television institutions crashing down for good. To understand why the cancellation hit so hard, you first have to understand who Benny Hill actually was, not the leering, cap-tilting character the cameras loved, but the real man underneath the grease paint. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, England. His upbringing was modest and unremarkable in the best possible way. His father managed a surgical appliance shop. His grandfather, however, had been a circus clown, and perhaps that distant spark of performance DNA was always quietly waiting to ignite. Hill's early working life bore no obvious signs of stardom. He stacked shelves at Woolworths. He delivered milk. He drove trucks. He even played drums in small-time venues, learning the rhythms of performance long before he ever stepped in front of a camera. These weren't wasted years. They were research. Every character Hill ever played, every put upon every man stumbling through absurd situations, was drawn from the reservoir of ordinary life he accumulated in those early, unglamorous jobs. When World War II arrived, Hill was called up for military service, training as a mechanic in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. He was deployed to Normandy in 1944, serving as a truck driver and searchlight operator during some of the most brutal fighting of the Allied campaign. Before the war ended, however, he transferred to the Combined Services Entertainment Division, the military's morale-boosting performance wing, and it was there, performing for exhausted and battle-worn troops, that Benny Hill truly discovered what comedy could do. It could transform a room. It could make men who had seen terrible things laugh again. That was no small power, and Hill never forgot it. After the war, he threw himself into show business with the single-mindedness of a man who had seen enough of the real world to know he preferred the imaginary one. He adopted the stage name Benny as a tribute to his hero, the American comedian Jack Benny, whose deadpan precision and impeccable timing Hill deeply admired. He hustled through the music hall circuit, appeared on radio variety programs, and slowly, painfully built a reputation as someone worth watching. When television finally came calling, he was ready. On January 15, 1955, The Benny Hill Show made its debut on the BBC, and British television was never quite the same again. The format was rooted in the tradition of music hall variety, a mix of live sketches, pre-recorded segments, musical numbers, and the kind of broad, physical comedy that needed no translation to be understood. Hill had an instinctive genius for visual humor, for the perfectly timed pratfall, the exaggerated reaction, the slow burn gag that paid off 3 scenes later. He wrote most of his own material, which was unusual for the era, and his voice ran through every sketch like a watermark. The show moved to Thames Television in 1969, and that transition transformed it from a popular domestic program into a global phenomenon. Under Thames, the format shifted to 1-hour specials rather than weekly episodes, giving Hill more room to develop elaborate set pieces and cinematic chase sequences. The production values improved dramatically. The writing became sharper, the performances more polished, and the audience grew not just in Britain, but around the world. The show was eventually broadcast in over 140 countries, with Hill becoming one of the most recognized faces in international comedy. In 1971 alone, viewer numbers in Britain exceeded 21 million, a figure that put the show in the same conversation as the most watched programs in the country's television history. The iconic elements that defined the Thames era became cultural shorthand. The chase sequences, filmed using undercranking techniques that sped up the footage into glorious, frenetic absurdity, were set to the relentlessly cheerful yakety sax by Boots Randolph, a piece of music so thoroughly colonized by the show that it became universally known as the Benny Hill theme. In 2015, decades after the show's cancellation, ITV viewers voted it the #1 television theme of all time. The Angels, Hill's rotating troupe of dancers and comic performers, brought a theatrical glamour to the production that distinguished it from its more Spartan competitors. Jackie Wright, the diminutive, bald-headed actor who patiently absorbed Hill's affectionate head-slapping, became one of television's most beloved straight men. The formula worked because every element of it had been considered, refined, and calibrated by a man who understood comedy at a molecular level. But even the most precisely calibrated machine can become outdated. And it was a sketch in the late 1980s, a parody of a beauty pageant, that finally exposed the widening gap between what the Benny Hill show represented and what British audiences were increasingly prepared to tolerate. The sketch was not in isolation, dramatically different from dozens of others the show had aired over its long run. It featured the familiar ingredients: scantily clad women, ogling male characters, double entendres stacked like a comedy buffet, and Hill at the center of it all with his signature expression of innocent, wide-eyed mischief. But the context had shifted entirely. By the late 1980s, British comedy had undergone a revolution. The so-called alternative comedy movement had spent the better part of a decade dismantling the assumptions that underpinned shows like Hill's. Assumptions about who got to be the subject of a joke and who always ended up as the punchline. What the beauty pageant sketch did, more than any single previous episode, was make the show's gender politics impossible to ignore or excuse. Women were presented as props, objects to be assessed, pursued, and laughed at, in a sketch that offered them no agency, no wit, no humanity beyond their physical appearance. Viewers who had previously laughed along without too much reflection suddenly found themselves watching differently, and what they saw made them uncomfortable. The sketch didn't introduce a new problem to the Benny Hill show. It simply made an old problem visible at exactly the wrong moment. The timing was devastating. British television in the late 1980s was in the middle of a genuine reckoning about what it put on screen and why. Audiences had been educated by a decade of sharper, more self-aware comedy. The sketch landed like a stone thrown into a mirror, and the cracks spread in every direction. The cultural pushback against the Benny Hill show had been building for years before the cancellation, but it crystallized most publicly in the figure of Ben Elton, comedian, writer, and one of the leading voices of the alternative comedy generation. Elton made no secret of his contempt for what Hill's show represented, and he said so loudly and repeatedly. In January 1987, speaking in Q magazine and on the television program Saturday Live, he leveled an extraordinary accusation: that the Benny Hill show was not merely offensive, but actively harmful, that its portrayal of women as objects of pursuit contributed to a cultural climate in which women felt less safe in public spaces. The claim was explosive, and the reaction was immediate. Defenders of the show argued that connecting a television comedy to real-world crime statistics was a logical leap too far. GQ magazine compared it to blaming concert pianists for elephant poaching, a reductio ad absurdum that captured the frustration of those who felt Elton was grandstanding rather than reasoning. One writer in The Independent described the pile-on against Hill as resembling the spectacle of an elderly man being attacked by people who should know better. The language was overwrought, but the sentiment behind it, that Hill was being made a scapegoat for broader cultural anxieties, resonated with many. Elton, to his credit, was eventually self-aware enough to acknowledge the irony of his position. In a later sketch on Harry Enfield and Chums, he appeared as a character called Benny Elton, a caricature of a humorless political enforcer, chased by angry women to the tune of yakety sax in a comic scene that seemed designed to demonstrate that even crusaders against certain kinds of humor can become absurd in their own way. But the damage was done, and it wasn't only reputational. The Broadcasting Standards Council weighed in, with a spokesman noting that the cultural consensus around what constituted acceptable comedy was shifting, and that content which had once seemed harmlessly cheeky was now increasingly viewed as outdated and degrading. When regulatory bodies start using words like degrading in connection with your flagship entertainment product, the boardroom conversations change in tone. Inside Thames Television, the executives had numbers to look at alongside the controversy, and the numbers were also telling an uncomfortable story. The show's viewership had declined significantly from its 1971 peak of 21 million. Production costs, meanwhile, had risen to approximately £450,000 per episode, a figure that translated to well over £1 million in modern currency. When advertising revenue follows audience numbers downward and production costs keep climbing, the financial arithmetic becomes brutally simple. In late May 1989, Thames Television announced that The Benny Hill Show would not be renewed. Benny Hill had been with Thames for 21 years. During that time, his program had reportedly generated £26 million for the company, predominantly from its extraordinary success in the American syndication market. American audiences had taken Hill to their hearts with an enthusiasm that surprised even his British admirers, and the Emmy nominations in 1980 and 1981 for Outstanding Variety spoke to the show's genuine transatlantic appeal. But the American market could not indefinitely sustain a show that was hemorrhaging its domestic audience and dragging a worsening reputation behind it like an anchor. Thames made the call. The show was canceled. An era ended. Hill himself said relatively little publicly about the decision. He was a private man by nature, a quality that coexisted oddly with his flamboyant television persona but was entirely genuine. He had never owned a home, preferring for most of his life to rent a modest flat in London. He bought cheap food, walked rather than taking taxis, and mended his clothes rather than replacing them. This was the man who had reportedly made Thames Television £26 million, living with the quiet, careful habits of someone who had never entirely forgotten what it felt like to have very little. After the cancellation, Hill did not retreat entirely. He attempted to develop new projects, most notably a concept called Benny Hill's World Tour, which envisioned him performing his comedy in the international locations where his original show had found its biggest audiences. Only one episode was ever completed, a special titled Greetings from New York, featuring familiar faces from the old cast, including Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton. It was later released on DVD and described, accurately, as Benny Hill's final television appearance. His health, meanwhile, was declining. In February 1992, he suffered a mild heart attack. His doctors recommended bypass surgery. Hill refused. He was subsequently diagnosed with kidney failure and declined dialysis. He continued living alone in his flat in Teddington, watching television, keeping to himself, maintaining the private existence he had always preferred. On the morning of April 20th, 1992, Benny Hill died in his armchair, in front of the television, at the age of 68. His body was not discovered for 2 days after a succession of phone calls went unanswered. The cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. On the day he died, a new contract from Central Independent Television had arrived in the mail, an offer he would never read. It was a detail almost too cruel to be coincidental, a final twist of the kind he might have written himself if he had been in a very dark mood. He was buried at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, not far from where he had been born. His estate, valued at over £7.5 million, was left primarily to his parents, who had already died. The money eventually passed to his 7 nieces and nephews. History is rarely straightforward in its judgments, and Benny Hill is no exception. The same show that made him a global icon became the vehicle for his cultural downfall. The sketches that delighted 21 million British viewers and introduced him to audiences from Sao Paulo to Seoul were also the sketches that critics used to argue he had done genuine damage to the culture. Both things can be true simultaneously, and perhaps that tension is precisely what makes Hill such a fascinating and irreducible figure. What is unambiguous is the scale of his talent and his influence. He wrote prolifically, performed brilliantly across an extraordinary range of characters, and constructed a comedic universe that was entirely his own. Generations of performers who came after him, even some of those who disagreed most sharply with his sensibility, absorbed lessons from how he built a sketch, how he used a camera, how he understood the architecture of a visual gag. In November 2021, That's TV announced that The Benny Hill Show would return to British screens as part of its Christmas schedule, its first nationwide broadcast in nearly 20 years. The audience was there. The nostalgia was real. The scene that ended the show did not erase what came before it, but it did something perhaps more significant. It marked the exact moment when the world Benny Hill had built his comedy for stopped being the world that was watching. That gap between the humor that was offered and the sensibility that was ready to receive it proved impossible to bridge. And so, one sketch at a time, one controversy at a time, one falling ratings point at a time, the curtain came down on one of the most remarkable and most complicated careers in the history of British television. The laughter didn't disappear entirely. It just moved on.